To say that the F1 sprint format has been controversial would be massively underselling just how mixed it has been. But we've now had all three of them at Silverstone, Monza and Sao Paulo, so I thought it would be a good time to see what's been good, what's been bad, but more importantly, I wanted to get the opinion of as many people as possible to kind of see how other people feel about it going forward. Everything from the name to the racing to the format, and even whether or not it belongs in Formula 1 has been debated. F1 clearly want the sprint to stay, but as it stands now, there are still major changes that need to be made before it's accepted by the fans, and after its first season, I thought it was a good time to ask if the sprint really has a long-term future in Formula 1. Now, before I talk about my opinion on the sprint and what Formula 1 themselves have said about it, I wanted to get as many thoughts as possible from my followers and subscribers, so over on my Twitter I sent out a quick tweet to see how people were feeling, just to get their snapshot opinion on whether they like it or not, and also what changes they think need to be made. The first tweet we have is from @Formula1Stat, who says, under the current format, it just devalues qualifying. I'm sure there's a way to make it work, but to be honest, I think there's too much F1 already. I strongly believe that the fastest lap should be for spring qualifying, as things are much fairer in terms of tyre wear. Now, something that's quite interesting that he said is number one, that there's too much Formula 1, and in a way with the massive calendar, I kind of see where he's going with that, and also in terms of the fastest lap point, which is already controversial in some people's eyes, maybe it should be just a thing for spring qualifying, so I think that's actually quite an interesting point to make. Next up, we have Kids Love F1, a good friend of the channel. He said the first two were very dull. The Brazil sprint was only good because Hamilton was starting from the back, which isn't going to happen every time. Overall, I think they add very little to the race weekend and the drivers aren't willing to take any risks. Traditional quali is miles better, and he also included a Gordon Ramsay gif, which we love to see as well. And yeah, this is an opinion that I have seen many times. I think this is one of the biggest kind of problems in terms of people don't really think that it adds anything, because traditional qualifying can be just as exciting and just as nail-biting instead of seeing not that much racing, unless again you have a leader like Lewis Hamilton starting from the back. Next, I'm actually going to combine two tweets because it's quite interesting to see kind of a little bit contrasting opinions. Maximus Ellen says, love a sprint weekend, makes being at the circuit on a Friday totally worth it, and there is something special about finishing work on a Friday and having to watch qualifying. And then Toot, who is a big Lance Stroll fan over on Twitter, which we love to see. I'm kind of happy we get to see more of racing in a weekend, but at the same time, quali on a Friday annoys me because it's a Friday and I want to do other stuff on a Friday and keep F1 to weekends. And again, really interesting. Some people like the fact that on Friday we have a competitive session, and some people feel like maybe there's almost too much Formula 1 and some people can't watch it on the Friday, so they like the fact that the two actual competitive sessions are on Saturday and Sunday, because of course some people have to work, they have school, or something else. So yeah, kind of interesting viewpoints. Next up, we have George, who says, absolutely hate them. No one seems to really care past first lap or will make risks with such low reward. Really hope the title for either isn't decided by the points margin gained/lost from them. And actually kind of similar to that, Dan Chamberlain also says, I don't see the point of them if there is no reward for taking risks with overtakes. Take out Hamilton's disqualification in Brazil and it would have been boring. I am not against sprint races, but I am not a huge fan of the current format. Even watching in person at Silverstone was boring. Again, two very valid opinions, and I have seen a lot of this. Obviously, two maybe more negative opinions, and that's totally fair. Very interesting from Dan, actually picking up that he did go to Silverstone and he did watch it, but he did not like it, even as a spectator, so that's definitely interesting, and I haven't seen too much of that, so yeah, I definitely wanted to pick up on that. And even George actually saying that whole risk versus reward, how much do the drivers really push, and also, does it kind of tarnish the title a tiny bit if the points margin does come down to what each of the drivers got in the sprint races? I mean, does that take something away from the eventual champion? I don't know, but yeah, again, very interesting little questions actually put by both of these two guys. Next up, we have @Spendana08, who says, they were just meh. They weren't bad, but they were also not so amazing that they should make an appearance at every weekend. More than the format, what I did not like about the sprint was the sprint qualifying setting the grid for the race. And this is easily the biggest kind of critique that I've seen. People don't like the fact that, even some people who do like the sprint, they don't like the fact that it sets the grid for the race because they think that that should be done over one lap. And kind of off the back of that as well, at Natural Paradigm, Bryson says, and he's actually got a few bullet points here, number 1, Friday qualifying must set the grid for the Grand Prix. Number 2, he says the sprint grid should be set by a fixed rotation, and he kind of elaborates on that a little bit later. Number 3, he says more points in the sprints and for more cars. Definitely agree on that one. Number 4, sprint races have their own championship, and then points from the sprint are added to the main championship in an intelligent way. So again, kind of similar comments in terms of the sprint is kind of, it's interesting to watch and they clearly do like it even if they don't love it, but it's the way it's integrated into the championship. Should it have an effect on the grid? Really, I mean, is that what we want? But is there another way in terms of the sprint being its own thing and then somehow those points that are given out should be added to the championship? So yeah, there's clearly a fine balance that Formula One, or certainly from these fans' point of view, there's a fine balance that Formula One has not managed to find, at least this season. Last up, and this is by Tommy, I really wanted to include this one because I thought it was very interesting. Sprint races should be driven by each team's third or young driver. The points should only count towards the constructors. And again, I really like this because there is still the excitement and something different about the weekend in terms of we have a sprint race, but this time it has no effect on the driver's title because the main drivers don't drive in it, and it gives an opportunity for their third or young drivers, more importantly, and it gives them that 20 or 30 laps to experience of Formula One and in the teams and kind of show off their talent as well. I mean, this would mean actually that we would only have 10 drivers, of course, because it would only be one driver per team, but I actually quite like this because it would mean that the teams have to pick a good third driver or a good young driver to give the opportunity because it still has constructors implications. So yeah, a very interesting element, and I'm actually a very big fan of that. Now, aside from getting people's opinions on Twitter, I wanted to have a more in-depth conversation with someone who, similar to me, got to experience the sprint format both from watching the sprint at home, but then also from the grandstand to actually see what the experience was like as a spectator. I always like to get fellow content creators on the channel, and so I talked to my friend Alexa Rendell, who's a content creator herself working within motorsport, and like all of us is also a huge fan of Formula One. The first thing I wanted to know is what her thoughts were on actually watching the sprint for herself in Silverstone.
Going to Silverstone and seeing it was so cool because it was the first time we'd had one that we didn't really know what to expect, what it would be like, and I think the crowd was really pumped for it. I was just general admission, so we were all standing together trying to tussle and get a good view, but people really were pumped to see what this would bring. And I mean, it brought some action pretty early on with Perez making a couple of mistakes, and the drama was there and everyone was excited, but in the end it did kind of just turn into that train and procession of cars around the track, which without commentary made it a little bit on the drier side, but I can't criticize it that much because for me, my dad and I only went on the Saturday. We'd never been to an F1 race before. We could never justify the cost. But being able to go on that Saturday where we could see the sprint race, we got free practice in the morning to see the cars sort of more one by one on a slightly slower pace while you're wandering around. We also got F2, we got the W series, and to me that was one of the best things about the sprint race, was that it gave the opportunity to go and see the cars for a slightly lower cost than you might have to if you're on a Grand Prix day. I think that makes it a bit more accessible, and maybe people disagree with whether or not sprint races are more accessible in themselves because they're shorter, but to me, I think the sprint race days themselves are more accessible because they're cheaper to go to, you get to see more, and also it puts the F2 and the W series on a slightly higher pedestal because people are going to see the sprints, but now also getting to see these really intense support races, which I loved. And then in comparison to Sao Paulo and the Italian Grand Prix, I think it was better to watch from home, personally. The commentary was what kept it interesting, spiced it up a bit. And I think those sprints in themselves were a little bit more dramatic, and there was more of a storyline there than perhaps there was by the point of the British Grand Prix. So overall, yeah, I think it was a really jam-packed couple of sprint races, but I do wonder if that was just the nature of the circuits we did it at and whether or not we would have actually just had intense races there anyway, regardless of the sprint.
The next thing I wanted to know is, did she think that the sprint actually achieved what it set out to do? And also if after the first three, she would like to see more of them in 2022.
I'd like to see more of it. I think everybody's calling for slight changes to it. I've seen a few drivers calling for it to be a standalone event with more points on offer. And to me, that perhaps is what I'd agree with, that if we're going to do something a bit out of the ordinary, a bit silly, let's do it to the extreme. Let's have more points. Let's try reverse grids. Let's see what really makes this a proper spectacle without it taking away from the traditional Grand Prix on Sunday that we all know and love. So yeah, I think overall I did love it, and I really thought it was a great change for us to have and to try something different. And it also broke up the season a little bit for me. I don't know about you, but with 23 races, having those throughout the year was, I don't know, it just signposted the season a bit, that you could relate it to what happened at the last one. And now we've had Brazil, we're in the run to the end of the season. We've only got a few races left. So yeah, I think it did its job in the sense of breaking up the season and creating more drama across the weekend. But yeah, as I said before, I don't entirely know if that was down to it being a sprint or if it was just a good track and we would have had chaos anyway. But I mean, come on, with Hamilton in Brazil, I don't know if he would have recovered quite as well as he did without that sprint race. So imagine if he'd done that in normal qualifying and had to go from P20. I don't think he could have made it to the win by the end of the race.
And lastly, I wanted to get her thoughts on what changes she thought need to be made to the sprint for the future.
I think it depends on how they format the weekend. That I would like to see them try things that they haven't yet. So even if that means changing sprint format, maybe from race to race for the time being until they get it right, if they're going to carry on with this. So maybe a one-lap shootout for qualifying for the sprint could be great, because if Hamilton messes up his lap, it puts him last. And if you suddenly have a George Russell doing like he did in Spa, where he's absolutely flying, that could completely mess up the grid without maybe impacting the integrity of what qualifying is, or having to force a reverse grid qualifying or championship that people seem to really resent. So I'd like them to try something like that, see if that works. Maybe we should try a reverse grid scenario where they use reverse championship order or something like that. It might just spice it up, give us all the drama we want, but maybe it would be too forced and maybe we could cause damage for the Sunday. Is that something we want? Is that going to impact the Grand Prix? So to me, as long as we're just trying things until eventually we get to a point where we go, okay, this is consistently making a good race, I'm more than here for the sprint races to stay, because I think it does spice things up and it does make a change. And the integrity for now, the Sunday Grand Prix is still there. I don't think I can deny that. But the sprint race is a spectacle and I'd like to see it stay, even if we change up a bit.
So in the end, I think Alexa echoed a lot of the same sentiment that a lot of my subscribers said on Twitter. Most people have been open to the sprint, and in general, from a spectator's point of view, when you have to pay a huge amount of money to just go for the Saturday, or if you're able to afford and go and watch the entire weekend, it does give you more for your money, and the novelty and excitement of it being a sprint weekend does make it going to the track more special, even if the racing itself for the people watching at home might not be as exciting. Looking ahead to the future from a financial side, and certainly from Formula One's perspective, they have been very happy with the reception, and even if they admit that it might need tweaking, they are going up a gear with more sprints planned for 2022. As I am recording this, there is no official news of how many sprints there are going to be and on which tracks, but both Stefano Domenicali, who's the CEO of Formula One, and Ross Brawn, who's the managing director, have both spoken in interviews about the potential changes that they are currently discussing, and also the future of the sprint format. Now, I'm going to go and summarize what each of them have said about it, but if you want to go in here and read word for word what they said, then I'll leave links below. As far as Domenicali, he was very vocal about how positive the circuit promoters were about the sprint format, and basically how there's almost a competition now between the other circuits over who gets to actually host a sprint. Now, this is not surprising because the sprint generates more attention, which in turn generates more revenue through ticket sales and more viewers, which then ultimately benefits Formula One. He also indicated that a third of the season could have sprint races, and when asked by Sky whether potentially that means something like 7 or 8, Domenicali replied by saying that this is a possibility. As far as Ross Brawn, he talked a lot more in depth about the evolution of the format. He said that F1 are discussing with the teams how the sprint could be more challenging and engaging on the Saturday, and he also acknowledged the fact that the Friday pole position just doesn't have the same weight. He also talked about the idea of reverse grids, and although he did admit that he would like to see them, he did then go on to say that perhaps it is a step too far. Now, Ross Brawn was very adamant to mention that every angle is being assessed by Formula One, from giving out more points from the sprint to entice the teams to take more risks, to even looking at the naming of the sprint because, in his words, the naming of the event is something we need to tidy up. So F1 are clearly looking at all of the ways in which they can grow the sprint format to give us better racing, but also make it more meaningful by handing out more points, but not overly impactful on the championship so that it starts to devalue a Grand Prix. So, that is the thoughts of my subscribers, a first-person point of view from Alexa and even from Formula 1. But what are my thoughts on sprint quali? Well, to be honest, my thoughts are very confusing and I'm not even sure that I have a coherent enough opinion about them because I still don't know if I like them and want to see more of them, or if I just don't see the point of them. Firstly, let me just say that going to Silverstone and being there for myself to watch the first ever sprint in F1, I definitely enjoyed the weekend as a whole more because there was an element of competitive excitement and tension on every single day. However, when I then watched it from home at Monza, qualifying was still cool on a Friday, but the sprint was actually kind of boring. I mean, it was great to see the McLarens so high, and it was interesting to see Lewis have a bad start, then knowing that he'll need to make up for it in the race, but that was kind of it. Brazil then threw something even more different into the mix with the Lewis comeback. That was exciting, and the skill on display by Lewis was incredible to watch, but I did leave wondering if the only reason the sprint was fun to watch is because by chance it was on that weekend where Lewis was sent to the back. I definitely think that there has to be some changes made to the sprint to make it more exciting. More points is definitely something that has to be considered, but it's got to be the right balance so that it's not too overpowering and doesn't make the Grand Prix less meaningful. But then there's the question of if the sprint should just be its own thing, and if it should have anything to do with qualifying and then the actual race. However, then there's the question on top of that of how do you make up the order for the sprint if it's just a standalone race? When it comes to the idea of reverse grids based on championship order, that is just something that I have never been able to get on board on, because to me, sending fast cars to the back artificially doesn't make seeing them get past slower cars more rewarding. The reason why seeing Lewis do it in Brazil was exciting is because that doesn't happen too often, and he was put there because of a genuine F1 circumstance, because his car failed scrutineering when his wing broke. Putting fast cars at the back on purpose just because they're fast, I think it will almost devalue the racing, and ultimately, and I've said this a million times, F1 is not about being nice to smaller teams because they've done a worse job. The budget cap is there to help them now get back up the grid, and they shouldn't be rewarded for not doing a good enough job just because it would be fun to see Max pull off a DRS overtake in every single sprint race. That's my view on reverse grids, and it still hasn't changed. To me, if Formula 1 has a Constructors' Championship where it rewards the teams that do the best job, there shouldn't be a racing format where it then rewards the teams that have done a worse job. For anyone that has been watching my channel for a while, you will know that I am never scared to share my honest opinion and that I simply call it as I see it when it comes to drivers and teams. But when it comes to the sprint, I am genuinely defeated by what I actually think of it. It's beaten me. The best way to summarize my confused opinion is that I love the idea of the sprint and I get excited every single time we have a sprint weekend, but I just don't like the sprint itself. That's where I am at the moment. I'm not quite sure what my opinion is, but I am sure that it will evolve throughout 2022. Whether you like it or not, the sprint is here to stay. It's far from perfect, and like everything in Formula 1, there is exactly zero agreement between the fans. I'm looking forward to seeing what F1 does with the sprint next year, but I'm going to be staying quietly cautious that they don't take it too far. Well, there you have it, another video wrapped up. A big thank you to Alexa for giving her thoughts on this very spicy topic, and I'm sure all of you are going to have your opinions in the comments box below, and I can't wait to see what you all have to say. If you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to drop it a like and smash that subscribe button to support the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.